So Jeff, we finally done. We finally have a Substack, and our first article on Substack is about new revelations about the DEFUSE proposal, and in particular about Peter Daszak and how he intended to fund that proposal after the Pentagon turned down funding. So let's unpack that all. That's a lot of words in one sentence there. So, Jeff, do you want to kind of take a stab at the kind of background to this?
Well, the way I look at this is it's an added detail to a story that we already knew most of the details about. However, the added detail is crucial. It's something that you and I suspected all along, and it's basically that the work on the DEFUSE proposal began far before the funding actually happened. So, we know that the proposal came out in 2018 and that they went to DARPA and they were trying to get money and they were turned down. And they were turned down because what they were asking to do was gain of function work. And when that proposal was made public, that was a real big deal because once you looked at this, you realize like, holy smokes, it's not just a proposal. As we've said many times, it is a literal blueprint for the manufacture of COVID. But you and I were always struck by the level of detail within that proposal. There was a lot of stuff in there that looked like they were analyzing their actual work as opposed to putting forth what they planned to do. And that led you and I, along with, I think, ultimately a lot of other people as well, to hypothesize that they'd already begun the work before they put in the proposal. And now we know it's true.
No, that's exactly right. And, from my years in academia, I can absolutely attest that you do not put in these huge proposals. Now, I was looking at much lower budgets in terms of doing research on some legal issue or whatever. I was looking at some five-figure sums. Now, these guys were looking at 14 or 14 and a half million US dollars. That's what they wanted for their DEFUSE proposal in 2018 from the Pentagon to make COVID-like viruses in a lab. So that's what it was about. Now, from my experience in academia, 100% you do not put in a proposal, whether it's for 50,000 or 50 million, especially not if it's for 50 million, unless you've already done a lot of the work. Because obviously you want to make sure that it's feasible, that it's doable, that whatever you're proposing is going to come up with some kind of result, or that you don't look like a fool in terms of what you've written down and someone says, well, this is just ridiculous. So you're going to have to do some work ahead of time. That's just a given. And as you said, everyone who was honest about it, when DEFUSE came out in 2021, and when the whistleblower leaked it to Drastic, you and I immediately knew, wow, this is a smoking gun. This is a blueprint for making COVID in the lab. What are the chances that they would have had a blueprint for making COVID in the lab in Wuhan, at the Wuhan lab, a year before COVID? I mean, it's just, game over at that point. That was 2021, and you and I were completely in agreement. That's it, game over. But as you said, the excuse that came from these natural origin people was like, oh, no, it was never funded. DARPA, the Pentagon decided not to fund it. Therefore, the work wasn't done. And, as you just said, as I explained in terms of the preparatory work that goes into these things, of course the work was done, or a portion of the work was done, to test feasibility, to make sure that you cross all your T's and dot your I's, to even know what you're going to write down. You talked about detail. Well, how can you write down all these details about, exactly where you're going to insert the furin cleavage site into virus backbones, all that kind of stuff, unless you've already done at least part of that work? And obviously now we know, because at least one of these new emails is from a lady called Tony Rock, who was part of this DEFUSE group, and it's to Barrick, the godfather of gain of function, who was also part of the DEFUSE group, along with Shijang Li from the Wuhan lab, and along with Peter Daszak from EcoHealth. So it was sort of those four. There's also one other guy, Wang Linfa, but we'll just leave him out for now. They were doing this, and so Tony Rock emailed Barrick with a very detailed question about an experiment he was doing about DEFUSE. And this was 3 months ahead of the thing being turned down. So while the project was kind of in limbo, waiting for funding, they were doing the work. That email is crystal clear. And, as you said, we knew it, but now we have documentary evidence of it.
Yeah, and it's worth probably reminding everybody as well, this whole argument that just because DARPA turned them down, that they weren't going to be able to carry through with this proposal. They were bringing the motherload of information to the CCP. They were translating all this U.S. technology, gain of function work, over to a CCP-controlled lab. So inherently, there was going to be funding there. Would it have been better if they could have gotten the money from DARPA? Sure. But, that wasn't a preclusionary effort. And now we know, indeed, that this money started earlier. Tony Rock must be really upset that her emails got out there, because there's been a couple of them that have been really kind of eye-opening. One other thing that always, I can't ever shake this one email, and it's one that I think it was Peter Daszak sent it out, and we sent it to Ralph Barrick, and he said, hey, make sure that we use Barrick's Gmail account because it won't be subject to FOIA requests. Everything they were doing was done with the eye towards hiding things. And in fact, to this day, we still haven't gotten the UNC emails. UNC is fighting like crazy to produce Barrick's emails.
On that note, there is, in the new batch, there is the one email from an EcoHealth representative, and the email starts off, I'm writing on behalf of Peter Daszak. And this is to the group. This is to the DEFUSE group, to Tony Rock, to Xi Zhengli, and to Ralph Barrick. Why won't Daszak have 3 minutes in his day to write to his friends? This is a very close-knit group. What's going on there? So just that in itself kind of struck me as, he's trying to wash his hands. He's just trying to keep a bit of distance in terms of getting this other guy to write on his behalf. But I guess the other guy is also like, hey, I don't want anything to do with it. So he literally starts his email like, I am writing on behalf of Peter Daszak. But it's what he says that is so amazing in terms of, again, we knew it, but now we have documentary evidence, because he says, it's a shame that, so this is a few months later in 2018, it's a shame the Pentagon turned us down for funding, but we're going to try and do this anyway and get funding elsewhere. So now we have it, in documentary form. So both that and the fact that Daszak was once again, trying to wash his hands.
Yeah, this is one of those details. You and I were talking about this a little bit offline yesterday, but this is one of those details that it's kind of easy for people to see it as sort of esoteric in the larger picture of things. And in part because I think a lot of people like you and I always thought that the funding had, rather that the work had gone on. But nevertheless, this is a major, major point, and I don't think, it doesn't seem to really be getting any attention out there that we now have this proof and it's in place. I saw something today, and it was from Eric Schmidt, Senator. I think he follows the both of us, and, good guy. And he was responding to something on Ralph Barrick, and what was he responding to? Oh, it was Fauci's pretense that he didn't know who Ralph Barrick was. And Eric Schmidt's response was, Fauci's a fraud. And my response to that was, why are you guys refusing to look at Ralph Barrick? Why is he not been called in? Why isn't all the focus on Ralph Barrick? And it's something that you and I keep saying over and over again, but that guy is just protected from on high. And it's very telling that Ralph Barrick is so removed from everything, despite the fact that he probably holds all the answers. Effectively, if you want to unravel this whole thing, I'm assuming that a one-on-one with Barrick with honesty involved, you could do it.
100%. So let's just go back to the timeline here. These new emails are from the first half of 2018. This is when the DEFUSE proposal was being drafted and being considered by the Pentagon for funding. That was that time period. So in the background, as we mentioned, they were discussing details of the proposal, actual experiments that they were conducting already. And then at the back end of that, June of 2018, it was the refusal, like, oh, didn't work out. They're not going to give us the 14 million, plus this sentence about, well, we're going to try and find funding elsewhere. Well, guess what?
Also, just worth noting is the fact we've talked about it before, but is how much they went to cover up the participation of the Chinese virologists in the whole thing from DARPA.
Exactly. I mean, we have the previous round of FOIAs where we got some draft documents of this DEFUSE proposal, and in the comments, which of course they thought no one would ever see, they say, let's put the Ralph Barrick lab in here, the North Carolina lab. Sounds good. Pentagon likes that kind of stuff. But then when we actually get the money, we're just going to shift the work over to Wuhan. It actually says that. So that was another huge smoking gun. And talking about Chinese funding and moving the work over to Wuhan, all of these collaborators, minus I think Tony Rock, we're not sure if Tony Rock made it to Wuhan, but all of the other collaborators suddenly showed up in Wuhan in the autumn of 2018. So a few months after the rejection from by the Pentagon. And we know through it's a long story, so I'm just going to cut to the chase here. We know from the Canadian lab scandal and all the documents and emails they released that the ostensible reason why they were in Wuhan was this conference at the Wuhan lab, but there was a secret side meeting. We don't know the details or whatever. It's just that there was a secret side meeting. So of course there's a suspicion then that the Pentagon didn't fund it. A few months later, they're all in Wuhan having side meetings, secret meetings. Well, what could that have been about, right?
Yeah, and there have been a number of these meetings too, where there's, groups of people that are brought together, some of whom don't seem to be terribly important, but others who do. And, you and I are both all but certain that there's any number of sidebar conversations that have actually gone on these things. And everything that Daszak did seems to have been designed with an eye towards not wanting to be exposed. Going back into 2018 and all the way through the present. Everything he's done has been done with an eye to keep himself from exposing himself, even to the way that he refused to list any conflicts of interest in, like his fraud paper, not the proximal fraud, but his, the paper that he submitted along with a few other scientists that he'd been soliciting. He'd refused to list his actual conflicts and what he was really doing, and that's been a consistent theme. Even think back about that email that he sent to Anthony Fauci at the outbreak of COVID, where Daszak was effectively giving Fauci talking points for the media, but yet talking about it very much as a natural origin, when clearly by that point he knew otherwise.
Yeah, that email, it was January 27th. It was kind of, just to let you know, I think it was both giving Fauci talking points as well as CYA, that if and when he gets into trouble, you can say, no, I told Fauci, Fauci,
that's probably
Fauci's
right.
problem. That sort of seems to be his MO. Because he says, we were doing these experiments and we were, playing around with these bat viruses and so on. That's in that email about the talking points for the media for Fauci. So yeah, just the fact that Daszak would be sending that email to Fauci, in the early stages before the public knew what was going on is extremely, troubling and suspicious. The other thing, the broader point here about Daszak is one that's not talked about enough or at all, which is how on earth is it possible that this virus arrives in December 2019 is the first time anyone heard of it. January, of course, 2020, more people heard of it. And Daszak knows, and by the way, then we know that the virus has a furin cleavage site at the S1, S2 junction. This is very important. This is not just inserting a furin cleavage site into a virus backbone. It's inserting it in a very, very specific spot and exactly in accordance with the DEFUSE proposal from a year earlier, 2018. How is it possible? I think this is the broader point that really needs to be talked about more. That Daszak, at that point in January of 2020, doesn't immediately go, okay, guys, I gotta let everyone know, just in the interest of transparency, there is a proposal, and we did share it with the Chinese, and we did kind of lay out how to construct a COVID-like virus, and here it is. I mean, there's absolutely no excuse whatsoever for not having done that at the time. And of course, instead, he tried to cover it up. And just to show you how extremely possible and feasible these cover-ups are, which I wouldn't have believed. If you'd asked me a few years ago, I thought, nah, you can't have 10, 12, 15 people involved and everyone covers it up. But it actually really happened. All the people on these DEFUSE emails, all the people who had a copy of DEFUSE, not just the Chinese side, the UNC side, the Tony Rock side, the US Geological Survey, Daszak's office, there's so many people, and every single one of them covered it up until it was finally leaked.
Yeah, I mean, that is such a great point, because of the fact that that proposal was submitted by that group and submitted into DARPA. There was, I don't know, I would think hundreds of people that were aware of this proposal, and everybody resolutely stayed silent. We had no hint of this until this thing was finally released, and it was like we couldn't believe it when we saw it. And you talk about the cover up. It is hard to accept. And I think that's one of the things that's been kind of an obstacle for people. But think about it this way. When the WHO sent over their investigative team to look at what happened, to try to arrive at answers, where they produced a formalized report and said that, it's a natural origin, nothing to see here. Who was on that team? Peter Daszak, who's literally going over and directing the WHO and running interference, and told them that, hey, don't worry about it. I know that the database of all the viral genomes, virus sequences at the WIV was taken offline, but you can trust me. You don't need to look at that. There's nothing there that you're going to need to find. Absolutely unbelievable. There's no rational way that the WHO simply went along with that, out of naivety. They had to not want to see it. In other words, you talk about the extent of the cover-up, and it's hard to appreciate and hard to kind of really accept, but that's the fact. And we have the demonstrable proof of that after the fact by their own actions. It's impossible to accept that the WHO would simply say, oh, yeah, sure, Peter, you're right. We don't need to look at that. They didn't want to look at it. That's what it was. And the whole thing was a paper mache. The WHO's done, 3 different investigations now? And
Correct.
They've only done them because they've been forced to by public pressure, because each one's been utter shit. That's just, and they finally have gotten a little closer to the truth, but it's been death by 1,000 cuts with them refusing to release as much as possible.
It really is just unbelievable. Daszak is involved with DEFUSE. A virus that looks just like a DEFUSE virus suddenly appears in the city with the lab that had the DEFUSE blueprint. Daszak's involved with the lab. Daszak has a long history with the lab. Daszak doesn't tell anyone about DEFUSE. Daszak sends Fauci talking points for how to make this problem go away. Daszak writes the Lancet letter that you mentioned earlier. Daszak then immediately gets invited on the first WHO group to go to China. Then he's on the second WHO group. And I don't think he was on the third one.
He wasn't.
It's unreal that all of those things, actually happened. It's like the guy who probably caused it all was also, it's like the policeman is investigating his own crime. I mean, it's literally, that's the analogy here. And even if it's not his own crime, he is so entangled in it that it's just completely unfathomable that actually happened. And yet it actually happened. And, one of the first people to see through this was President Trump in around mid-April. It took him a while because probably everyone was lying to him, proximal origin, this, that, and the other. But sort of by mid-April, he was out there telling the media, no, this looks like a lab leak. And of course, we already talked about this on a previous show. There was this massive pushback. But as relates to Daszak, and this is my point here, Trump very wisely and rightly immediately cut the grant. It was like, no more money for EcoHealth. We can't do this. This is ridiculous. It's completely ridiculous. And then, of course, Fauci was like, okay, in his usual style, waited for 2 months, and then he gave Daszak the money back, plus he gave him another tranche. So basically, Daszak, because Trump cut his funding, Daszak ended up with twice as much as he had before.
Yep, exactly. And there's another aspect to this story, too, right at the critical juncture with the same parties involved. And I'm talking about the NASM meeting, the National Academy of Sciences and Medicine. And, that happened on, I want to say February 2nd, might have been February 3rd of 2020. And the same parties, NASM, the White House went to NASM and said, hey, can you help us determine the origin of COVID? They wanted to know very early on. NASM reaches out. Who do they inexplicably reach out to? But the group, Fauci and Daszak and Christian Anderson and Gary. Barrick was involved in that. Like the only thing where Barrick's kind of had a semi-public, he wasn't on the conference call, or at least we don't know that he was. But, he was part of this NASM thing as well. And that was where Daszak was convening his Lancet letter. We had these emails from the NASM meeting where they're clearly formulating and presenting a natural origin narrative despite the day before saying that, hey, this thing was engineered in a lab. So there's no, that whole narrative about over time we shifted our viewpoints as an accumulation of evidence built up. Even that's absolute crap. That's not what happened. with one day, this looks like an engineered virus. Next day, telling Nasim that it's a natural origin. So, and Daszak was part of that. It's unbelievable.
It truly is. And yeah, I mean, that argument was always ridiculous from day one.
Yeah.
We changed our mind overnight or even like on the spot, because we
Well,
have
according to Jeremy Farrar, it was a number of months, right? In his book.
and we have their private messages, and they didn't change their mind because in private they were still lab leak. And those people say
but
no.
again, my point is they presented a difference of opinion the very next day. So even there, Farrar's outright line in his book, it wasn't a matter of months. They presented a false narrative the very next day.
And in an extreme way. I mean, Daszak was pretty extreme with his language about, these, did he say racism? But, he invoked those kinds of words. We'd have to look at the exact words in the Lancet letter, but it was pretty extreme language, like, how dare you mention the lab leak, And of course, Anderson called it a crackpot conspiracy, the day after at Nasim. So totally agree. And this point isn't made nearly enough. It wasn't they changed their mind over months. It was like literally the next day. But just to take care of what happened a few months later. Well, a few months later, Anderson was still private messaging his friends that he still thinks it's a lab leak. So none of that ever worked. But I think another point that just frustrates me, how it hasn't really kind of come through and isn't widely appreciated. We didn't even have to wait for all these private messages to come out. We didn't even have to wait for the DEFUSE proposal to leak. All the information that was needed on the science side was already out there. It was out there in real time. And I remember you and I found it, not just us. I mean, other people found it as well. But you weren't allowed to talk about it. On Twitter, you were banned for talking about it. Zero Hedge was banned for even just mentioning it. And so it was very scary. It was kind of this a very private endeavor. You had Xiao Boutao, the Chinese guy, who was then shut up. He put out a paper saying, well, this came out of the Wuhan lab very early, I think February 6th or something. Don't quote me, but really, really, really early. You had Rosanna Segreto on a viral blog in great detail taking this thing apart. And of course, you had Yuri Dagin. He wrote a seminal piece, really, really long piece, again, in all the scientific details about why this is probably engineered. And we're talking right at the start of COVID. So this idea that, it took us time and whatever is just junk. It's just rubbish.
Yep, it is. And, they weren't the only ones. We've talked about it before, but we know that the State Department very early on formulated their own opinion, that the only possible explanation was that it came from a lab. I think they went so far as to say that they went through all the different theories. There was 5 of them, and they went through all of them. And again, bear in mind, this is in early April 2020. And their conclusion was it's the only possible explanation is a lab leak, and the other explanations have been created to divert attention from the actual origin of COVID. That's literally in their assessment.
And then the Pentagon as well. So we have the whole everything. We've got everyone here. The Pentagon said lab leak, that secret paper. Why didn't those guys come forward? Why didn't they say something? This was I don't think it has a date, that paper. It said, I think it was May 2020 without a specific date. The Pentagon's assessment.
Yeah, that's right. May
As 2020. You mentioned, the State Department assessment was a month earlier. That was in April. Yep. We had Yuri's paper we just talked about, Rosanna's, copious notes on the viral blog, Xiao Baotao's paper. It's just on and on and on. I mean, anywhere you look, the evidence was already clear. And even in the private messages of these natural origin hoaxers. So literally everywhere was lab leak. The only place where it wasn't was in the public domain in terms of the media and letting the public know the truth. And, as we mentioned, Trump tried to do it and he was slapped down pretty bad. This was mid-April 2020. I'm not sure he ever gave up, but I think he just kind of shifted to focusing on the, on the remedies and on all the problems caused by the virus rather than the origin. Remember, he had this press conference. He said, yeah, it probably came out of a lab. Pretty sure about that. And the very next day, Fauci was up there on the White House podium. Why was he ever given that, that platform? Completely trying to debunk everything, no, natural, whatever, with Trump standing right next to him. And then Fauci saying, because of proximal origin, we now know it was natural. And then he pretended not to know the authors of proximal origin, even though Fauci had commissioned the paper.
Well,
The
not
guy
only
is
commissioned,
such,
he edited it.
all of the above. The guy is such a total fraud on any scale, on any standard, and yet, he's still being celebrated by the media, and half the population has, probably more than half, has absolutely no idea of any of the stuff we've just talked about, even though all of that is documented.
Yeah. And there was very much a quiet war that was going on in the background. And it was sort of Peter Navarro pitted against Anthony Fauci. And those two went back and forth. And we're talking on the use of hydroxychloroquine, ivermectin, what they should do in terms of shutting down flights, all of it. Whereas Navarro was concerned, wanted to shut down flights, wanted to look for anything that could be used to help combat COVID. Fauci was against every bit of it. And that's the same time frame when Trump was starting to introduce, it was like you said, it was a series of press conferences where he first started to hint that he thought it could have come from a lab, and he got more and more firm about it. And right as he was getting ready to deliver a firm statement, that's, as you mentioned, that's when Fauci stepped in. But Trump wasn't done. He was still convinced, rightly so, that it came from a lab. And he literally made a definitive statement on the same day that the DNI, in real time, the DNI released a statement from the intelligence community that basically shot down the lab leak and said it was natural origin. They were careful with their words. They said it wasn't man-made or engineered, I believe is what they said.
Right.
But real time, where Trump was literally at a press conference, hadn't seen it, one of the reporters, I think it might have even been John Roberts, was sitting in the gallery and said, hey, wait a minute, I'm getting a notice here that your intelligence community in real time is saying that everything that you're saying up on the podium is false. Now, unfortunately, everything Trump was saying was true. But that all came about really because of the State Department email, the State Department determination that came out in April. So all these things were interplaying, that as the truth was starting to come out, the IC, the intelligence community, saw what was happening and literally took preemptive action to issue a statement that kneecapped Trump in real time on national television. It's unbelievable, which again, getting back to this point about the level of coordination to cover this thing up, and why is that the case?
I often wonder what would have happened if Trump's presidential commission on the origin of COVID had gone ahead as planned. Now, we know the details because of Navarro. I mean, you mentioned Navarro already. He was kind of fighting on the one side, and all these other characters were fighting on the other side, with Trump kind of in the middle. Well, I guess he was kind of on Navarro's side, but, for various reasons. It was an election year. He had all these terrible advisors. I mean, the list is long. We can talk about that some other time, but he I guess he was kind of being torn back and forth or whatever. And then in the end did not go ahead. And Navarro actually says that is his biggest regret in the entire, 4 years. So that's a pretty big statement, because a lot of stuff happened, good and bad, So
I did a pretty in-depth dive on that. And maybe that's something I will put up on Substack and write that up, is that back and play. The conclusion that I came to is that Navarro may have been like the only honest guy in Trump's administration. And yes, Trump was listening to him, but the problem that he was facing was one of politics, that every other person was more or less loosely or directly aligned with Fauci and telling him something different. And not only that, because I think Trump was still willing to stay firm to his belief. I don't think he was ever unaligned with Navarro. But he faced a very real problem that people would go out and hamstring him by leaking comments to the media, the intelligence community reaction, et cetera, et cetera. So it made it very difficult for Trump, because he was continually being undermined by statements that directly opposed him.
As you mentioned with the DNI, I mean, it's probably one of the most blatant examples of that, of deep state undermining the chief executive, that you could ever wish to see. While Trump, as you mentioned, was having a press conference where he was saying this came out of a lab, the DNI released a statement saying that it didn't come out of a lab. And you couldn't have a more blatant example of this thing. And, he faced it every day.
But the timing of that was so important too, because they knew he was building to a crescendo. They
Right.
knew that was the day that he was going to say it came from a lab. That day was not picked by accident. Fauci knew, like, okay, I kind of held him off by pointing to proximal fraud and pretending I don't know, it's an objective paper when it wasn't. He knew what Trump was going to say at the next press conference. And sure enough, that's what Trump said, and the IC destroyed him.
Absolutely. Now, before we close here, I'd like to kind of touch on what sort of more evidence do you want, or what are you looking for, or what sort of what would you like if you had like a magic wand in
Ralph
terms of the
Barrick.
origin?
Ralph Barrick.
Yeah, no, same here. We talked earlier about these new emails came out of the U.S. Geological Survey. There's a long story behind that. It's kind of a back door into FOIA because they happen to have it because of this lady, Tony Rock. So it was really just she was kind of involved in that project. So therefore she had some of the emails. Therefore it was a back door into the FOIA. At the same time, everyone else is blocking the FOIAs, especially University of North Carolina. So, that's the short story of it. But Tony Rock only had a sliver of the emails, only the ones that were shared with her or that she shared with the other team. Now, for instance, Tony Rock's emails do not comprise emails between Barrick and Xi Jinping. Mm-hmm. They do not comprise emails between Barrick and Daszak. And remember, you already mentioned they specifically said they wanted to use Gmail. Barrick's wife seems to be a big fan of Daszak. That we could sort of discern that from one of these emails. So completely agree with you. Even though this was very useful, the Tony Rock stuff from the Geological Survey, it's just a tiny piece of what there is. I mean, can you imagine Barrick's emails with Xi Jinping?
Well, I just can't get past the fact that both you and I are completely convinced that Barrick holds the key to everything. That if you got Barrick to open up, you'll understand exactly what happened. All the details are there. He's the guy that provided the humanized mice that enabled the entire experiment. It took a long time for us to figure out. We knew that he had done it. It took a long time to find that. Now, in the midst of all the releases, that's kind of been lost. But it's the fact that nobody's going after Barrick. He is the most obvious person to look into, and yet he's the most elusive of them all. How is that possible? It's only possible if he's being protected. Anybody who walks into this situation with any sort of background knowledge is going to know that Barrick is the guy that you want to talk to, and you want to get every bit of information and every bit of FOIA documents that you can, and yet somehow he's this elusive, mystical shadow that nobody can get their hands around.
100%. Take yourself back to January 31st, 2020. There is going to be the secret teleconference, supposedly to find out where this thing came from. Fauci organizes it. Okay. So let's say you're Fauci. Who are you going to call? What are you going to do? So let's say I'm Fauci. I don't know anything about bat viruses, whatever. I go on the internet. I just search for novel SARS viruses, just go to Google Scholar, whatever. The name Barrick will just be all over the place. There is only one name that you go to. That's it. And he happens to be American, so you could just invite him in. Oh, and you happen to know him. So why don't you invite him in? Barrick has written more papers on SARS viruses than everyone else put together. That's another statistic that sort of, kind of gets totally lost in all the noise. He's the guy. He is your one guy, and he's nearby. He's at the University of North Carolina. You call him in. Let's talk about where this thing came from. And he's the one guy who was not invited to the secret teleconference, either because they were protecting him in terms of we can't get him dirty, or he had some other role to play with the Wuhan lab, IC, whatever, or because they didn't want to hear what he was going to tell them. I mean, those are the only two options I see.
Yeah, nope, that's exactly right. And remember that Fauci, he pretended that he didn't know who the authors were in that April press conference, but he's not denied later on that he knew Daszak or that he knew Christian Anderson, Robert Gary, all of that. The one person that he's denied knowing is Ralph Barrick.
Yeah, I know, it's incredible.
And it's a laugh. We know that it's provably false because we know he's met with Barrick any number of times, including not that far before he denied saying that he even knew him. So,
well, a few days after the secret teleconference, he invited Barrick to his office.
Yeah.
And initially, we knew that indirectly because another guy in one of those text messages that we got last year, another guy in this kind of wider proximal origin group was saying, "Oh, I heard that Barrick spent a day in Fauci's office talking about this virus, and what I'm not sure of the exact wording, but anyway, spent a whole day there." This is February of 2020. Well, with one of the new releases, we now have his schedule, Fauci's schedule, and it's on, I think it was February 11th, 2020. It's got Barrick right there. So for that's just an outright lie. By the way, that was under oath when he pretended not to know.
Yes, that's a good point. A lot of people look over that. That was under oath. And it's
So-
also for, not just that meeting that was scheduled, but Ralph Barrick was there at NASM in DC that February. He was part of that entire group. Fauci gave a 10-minute presentation. Barrick was there. Daszak was there. Anderson was there. So anyway, it all comes back. Why is Barrick been so protected? And, I think the reason he's been so protected is because if he tells the truth, it unravels the U.S. government's participation in all of this, and they can't have that. And nobody wants to touch him.
One thing's for sure. Even though we think we know the whole story, and I think we know the story to the extent that this thing came out of a lab, but and that's firm. But there are going to be a lot of twists and turns in terms of the details and I think the level of entanglement and the level of sharing biotechnology with the Wuhan lab, and just there's going to be stuff there, secret meetings and stuff that we can't even imagine right now how bad it really is.
I think that's right. The one other thing, and maybe we can close with this, is I also think they're worried about ripping off the Band-Aid. Once you admit that this was a lab leak, immediately people are likely to going back and looking at other outbreaks. We've said it before on the show. I'm personally convinced that the Ebola outbreak came out of the Kanema lab, which was run by Anderson and Gary. And I think people will go back and look at these other events, and I don't think they're going to like what they find. And I think that's all part of this, that the involvement was much deeper, but that we've also got problems with past outbreaks happening as a result of, the same mistakes and the same experiments. Gain of function should be banned, just plain and simple. It should be banned.